folks, everybody sing. Now when the saints go marching in, there is a house in New Orleans. Pumped a lot of pain down in New Orleans.
We took a little bacon and we took a little beans and we caught the bloody British in a town in New Orleans.
Yes, I want to be in that number. When the saints go marching in.
Welcome back to the History of New Orleans. In the last episode, we covered the booming decades after the Battle of New Orleans in which the population and the wealth of New Orleans exploded as new technology and a shifting political landscape rocked the city, the state of Louisiana, and America. Now we will pick up where we left off with the election of Pierre d'Aubigny in 1828, the first governor officially belonging to the new National Republican Party. While all the southern states overwhelmingly supported Andrew Jackson's Democratic Party in the presidential election, Louisiana was one of the most contested, and the state government remained in the hands of Jackson's opponents. Despite Jackson's considerable celebrity in the most important city in the state, New Orleans. Unfortunately for the Democratic Party, the economic interests of the politically active notable citizens of New Orleans came before any superficial popularity contest. The real sticking point for the voters of New Orleans was tariffs and internal improvement. Tariffs, and more generally economic protectionism, were needed to allow the sugar plantation owners to sell their product in a market that was dominated by foreign powers. Even though the Democratic platform had several positions that appealed to wealthy landowners in Louisiana, the issue of tariffs was important above all others. The issue of internal improvement was related to economic protectionism under the umbrella platform of the National Republicans, called the American System. It called for the strengthening of the American domestic market through promoting internal trade and penalizing foreign exports with tariffs. And so we get to the election of pro-tariff, pro-development National Republican Governor d'Aubigny, who was notable for two things. One, he was Creole. Well, actually he was a native Frenchman, born in Europe, but he was adopted by the Creoles and represented their community. This meant that power in the state government had again flipped from Anglo-American to Creole. However, the planned relocation of the state capital from New Orleans to Donaldsonville was continued. The other reason that d'Aubigny was notable was that his premature death only 10 months into his term set off a period of rapid, chaotic political turnover within the Louisiana state government. In October of 1829, d'Aubigny's horse-drawn carriage capsized, crushing him and causing him to die of his injuries after 3 days of excruciating pain. He was immediately succeeded by the president of the Louisiana State Senate, a Creole anti-Jacksonian named Armand Beauvais. It was a controversial action since there wasn't any precedent about the line of succession for governorship in the case of death. Beauvais technically had no claim to the office, and so a constitutional crisis occurred, which eventually led to the calling of a special election in 1830. Beauvais only served for 3 months, and his only accomplishment was the finalization of the transfer of the state capital to Donaldsonville. He resigned from office after 3 months so that he could campaign in the special gubernatorial election. Beauvais would end up earning less than 15% of the vote in this election, as his fellow Creole National Republican André Roman won the election. The special election occurred in July of 1830, but Roman would not be sworn in until January of 1831. In the meantime, we get the lame duck impromptu governorship of Jacques Dupré. Governor Dupré was Creole. In fact, he was the first governor of the state to be born in New Orleans. He had been elected to the Louisiana State Senate in 1828 and became president of the Senate after Beauvais took the governorship when d'Aubigny died. Dupré would then himself ascend to the governorship when Beauvais resigned. Like I said, this was a period of rapid, chaotic political turnover. Despite the fact that he had not been elected to the position, and his time was limited as André Roman would soon take over, Dupré was able to accomplish a few notable things during his time at the head of the Louisiana state government. For one, he continued the promise of internal improvement that d'Aubigny had started. In the last episode, we discussed the new modes of transportation that would come to New Orleans in the 1830s, including one of the first railroads in America and a new canal extension. Well, these were all built by companies that were incorporated under Dupre's administration. Dupre also reversed the move of the state capital. After almost 4 years of planning and execution, Donaldsonville was the capital of Louisiana for less than a year. New Orleans would retain this honor thanks to Governor Dupre. However, there was a part of Dupre's governance that was less than honorable. He signed a law that banned any free person of color from moving to Louisiana, as the white elites were becoming worried about the demographic dominance of this group in New Orleans. The law also called for the expulsion of any free person of color who had moved to the state in the last 5 years. This was an example of how the overtly racist attitudes of the American South had become more prominent in New Orleans. Before statehood, the city's white and black residents had never lived together in complete harmony, but there was a mutual understanding between them that the people of color were an important fixture to the city, and any direct attack against them would hold consequences. Now, with the backing of the domineering white supremacist American government, greater persecution of the black population was forthcoming. But for now, it was time for Dupre to step aside and for Andre Roman to take the oath of office. As a consequence of the special election, the terms of the U.S. presidents and the governors of Louisiana would no longer line up perfectly, which is a bit annoying but not a major problem. Therefore, Roman became governor in the midst of Andrew Jackson's first term as president, and continued his predecessor's support of internal improvement and protective tariffs. Well, actually, he didn't support all protective tariffs. See, the National Republicans had their basis of power in the northern states, and while the state government of Louisiana supported tariffs in the case that they protected the American sugar market, this was not exactly the party line. The northern National Republicans wanted tariffs that protected their manufacturing businesses, which was in direct opposition to southern states that relied on buying cheaper manufactured goods from Great Britain. This disagreement had come to a head in 1828, when President John Quincy Adams signed a bill that levied a system of tariffs that the southern states would deem the Tariff of Abominations. Adams had supported this bill because it was what his northern supporters wanted, but it was a slap in the face to the Louisiana National Republicans. This issue had still not been resolved by the time Andrew Jackson was deciding economic policy in 1832. President Jackson wanted to find a compromise that would appease both sides. The Democratic Party was on paper an anti-tariff, anti-strong federal government party, but the political reality was that Jackson could not afford to just repeal the 1828 tariffs. Instead, he passed the 1832 tariff bill that lowered the rates of the previous bill, but kept it mostly intact. This ended up not being the compromise position that would appease both sides, and South Carolina, who felt the sting of the tariffs more than any other state, made the controversial move to declare the 1832 tariff unconstitutional and nullified its effects within the state's borders. The nullification crisis was the biggest act of defiance between state and federal governments until the Civil War, and it immediately created two camps on the national stage, those that supported President Jackson and those that supported South Carolina. I bring up the nullification crisis in our discussion on New Orleans because it helps illustrate the unique position the city and its politicians were in. On one hand, New Orleans and Governor Roman were national Republicans that identified themselves by their opposition to Andrew Jackson and his Democratic Party. On the other hand, Andrew Jackson was not acting under the nominally defined party line of the Democratic Party. The imposition of tariffs by the federal government over the objections of the states was definitively anti-states' rights. Jackson even went as far as signing into law the Force Bill, which allowed the federal government to use the army to enforce tariffs within the states. I can't stress enough how Jackson had run on a platform of fighting against the tyranny of federal government, and now he was acting as a dictator and threatening to use the military to enforce his decrees. This caused his wide base of support in the southern and western states to decry him as an authoritarian tyrant, but it did earn him favor from the northern states who supported the tariffs. New Orleans and Louisiana fell into a unique position. They were hurt by the tariffs, but the way that South Carolina went about opposing them was more worrying to the wealthy political class of the Crescent City. If South Carolina created the precedent that states could just decide to ignore tariffs, then what was stopping them from ignoring the tariffs on sugar that protected the Louisiana plantation economy? So Governor Roman jumped the political aisle to lend his support to President Jackson. The crisis finally ended when Jackson passed a new tariff bill that promised to lower rates gradually over the next 10 years until they were at the levels they were before the 1828 tariff bill. The whole debacle just goes to show how even though New Orleans was the largest and wealthiest southern city, its interests along with its character was remarkably different than any of its neighbors. Roman would spend the rest of his term avoiding any other political dramas and focused mainly on building up the state's financial and commercial infrastructure by more than doubling the number of state banks and building the railroad and canals we previously discussed. By the time his term ended in 1834, New Orleans was thriving commercially, and even though free people of color had been banned from entering and yellow fever was still killing thousands every year, the population was exponentially growing. The 1834 gubernatorial election was the first time in which a Creole candidate was not among the two highest vote getters. However, by this point, the ethnic tensions had cooled enough that the Creoles were more than willing to throw their support behind an Anglo-American, as long as he supported the Whig Party that they belonged to. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that in 1833, the National Republicans reformed into the Whig Party. The story behind the Whig name really helps put into perspective how titanic of a political figure Andrew Jackson was in the early 1800s. The name Whig comes from a silly-sounding name from western Scotland for cattle drivers, Whigamore. It was first used in the political arena in the 1680s as a pejorative for members of the Country Party, which opposed absolute monarchy in the United Kingdom. Eventually, these anti-monarchists, whose opponents sought to deride them as simple country bumpkins by dubbing them Whigs, would take up the name Whig with pride and represent the more liberal section of the British Parliament for the next 200 years. Across the pond in America, Andrew Jackson was beginning to earn the reputation of a tyrant with his heavy-handed governance and singular personality. So as a jab at him, the National Republicans merged with other anti-Jacksonian political factions to form the Whig Party, implying that they opposed monarchy by opposing King Andrew Jackson. Anywho, the Whig candidate in Louisiana won 62% of the vote, becoming the first candidate since Jacques Villers to win a majority of the popular vote, and the first candidate since Claiborne to win more than 60% of the vote. Governor Edward White Sr. capitalized on his historic victory by having an exceptionally boring term. There was no great political turmoil, and a nationwide depression meant that he had to focus most of his attention on modest improvements and balancing the budget as best he could. One notable contribution he did make to New Orleans was the chartering of the Medical College of Louisiana, which would eventually become Tulane University. It was also during White's term that New Orleans was divided into 3 municipalities, the first being the French Quarter and Treme District, the second being the American section or Uptown, and the third being the Old City or Downtown. The division of the city into these 3 districts severely limited the power of the mayor of New Orleans, as each municipality had its own council that made decisions independent of mayoral oversight. The office of mayor of New Orleans is one we haven't really touched on in this series, instead focusing on a wider picture with the governors of Louisiana. So I guess now is as good a time as any to briefly go over the first batch of mayors leading up to the city's split and their subsequent sidelining. From statehood in 1812 to the split in 1836, the mayors of New Orleans were exclusively Creole. The first elected mayor was Nicolas Giraud, who had the unenviable task of preparing New Orleans for the War of 1812, which must have stressed him out because a few months after the Battle of New Orleans, he resigned. He was followed by Augustin de Macarty, a man of Creole and Irish heritage. He was also given an unenviable task as his term included the first instance of a recorded yellow fever epidemic, and it was his job to organize the city's Board of Health to come up with the contingencies for containing future outbreaks of the disease. Macarty's 5 years in office saw some of the fastest growth of the city and the doubling of its commercial traffic, making him undoubtedly one of the most successful mayors in the city's history. However, there is a slight black mark on his legacy, as he bears an unfortunate relation to one of New Orleans' most notorious serial killers. His cousin was the dreaded Madame Lalaurie, maiden name McCarty, whose crimes will be a subject of a bonus episode released alongside this one. Mayor McCarty was succeeded by Louis-Philippe de Raffignac, who holds the honor of being the most interesting of this first batch of mayors. Raffignac was of French nobility, and just so happened to be the godson of the wife of Louis-Philippe II, Duc d'Orléans, the great-grandson of the New Orleans namesake. He served in the French army until 1800, when he settled in Louisiana and would go on to serve 10 consecutive terms in the Louisiana state legislature. He was first elected mayor of New Orleans in 1820, and would go on to be re-elected 3 more times, serving a total of 8 years. Mayor Raffignac was not unique in his desire to develop the Crescent City into one of the most modern and beautiful cities in America, but he was exceptional in the zeal in which he went about the task. He borrowed large sums of money to implement public works programs, such as citywide street lighting, which had been in the French Quarter for some time, but was now extended to the rest of the city. He also was the first to pave the streets, form a regular fire department, and create a public education system. Then he ran headfirst into the great immovable roadblock of New Orleans politics. Raffignac made the mistake of believing that he was strong enough to overcome New Orleans' habit for vice when he attempted to regulate gambling. In this endeavor, he was ultimately unsuccessful, but to his credit, no politician has ever managed to fight this battle and win. His story ends in a darkly humorous way. After serving as mayor, Raffignac retired and returned home to France to live out the next 18 years in comfort in the French countryside. Near the end of his life, he was confined to a wheelchair, where one day he was examining a loaded pistol. Coincidentally, at this moment he had a stroke, fell over, and the gun went off, shooting himself in the head. Raffignac became one of those bizarre instances of accidental suicide. The last man to win election to the mayoral office before the municipal split was Creole Democrat Denis Prieur. Perhaps it is a testament to how neutered the position became once the city was split that Prieur served for a record-setting 11 years across 6.5 terms, and his most notable achievement was killing a Louisiana senator in a duel. Although lots of things were happening in New Orleans during his time as mayor, including the dramatic first term of Governor Roman, he gets no mention in the historical record for anything he achieved during this years. He lost the gubernatorial race of 1838 when Roman won his second term, and it isn't really fair to say he faded into obscurity after that, because he was already pretty obscure. I think that's all we really need to cover for the mayors at this point, but I do want to make note of an interesting trend comparing them to the governors. The electoral base for the mayor of New Orleans is obviously just the population of the city, which was still now in the late 1830s predominantly Creole. French was still the most widely spoken language, and the Creole elite held an iron grip over the city. For this reason, a Creole man won the mayorship every election from statehood until 1846. On the other hand, the electoral base for the governor of Louisiana was heavily tied to New Orleans, as it was by far the most populous city in the state, not to mention its capital, except for a brief intermission. But there was also a sizable population dispersed throughout the state across hundreds of plantations in smaller cities like Donaldsonville and Baton Rouge. This meant that the Creoles did not have a political monopoly over the governorship, and this is the reason we saw the office flip-flop between Anglo-American and Creole candidates during this time period. Interestingly enough, we see the inverse relation with regards to party politics. While the governor during this period was almost always a Whig or one of its predecessor parties, with very little flip-flopping, the mayor of New Orleans alternated regularly between the Democratic Party, the Whigs, and at one point the Native American Party. Now, what caused this flip-flopping along party lines? To understand this, we must understand that outlier, the Native American Party. Now, contrary to how it sounds to our modern ears, the Native American Party was not a party that supported the rights of Indians, indigenous people, or whatever other term used for the original peoples who settled in America before the Europeans. The Native American Party was an organization that promoted Anglo-Saxon Protestant ownership over the United States of America. It opposed all so-called foreign influence brought by immigrants under the assumption that the Anglo-Saxons had done the hard work of settling the original colonies, and therefore had claim over all the United States as payment for their labor. The platform of the American Party was not as black and white as it first appears. Their ideology was first and foremost an anti-immigration stance, but this did not draw such distinct lines around race or religion. While a broad portion of the party was racist and anti-black, there was also a notable number of American Party members in the North that were anti-slavery. While the party was staunchly against Catholicism, as they believed that Catholics were beholden first to the Pope in Rome, and therefore could not be loyal American citizens, they did not overtly persecute the minority populations of Jews and Muslims in the United States. Even in some cases, where practical concerns overcame party dogma, Catholicism was not outrightly condemned. This was the case in New Orleans, where the Native American Party thrived on villainizing and persecuting the massive numbers of German and Irish immigrants who were supposedly stealing the jobs of good, honest Americans. But the party relied on the votes of the Catholic majority Creoles in the city, and so they made a little caveat to their rhetoric that New Orleanian Creoles were French Catholic, and therefore somehow different from the Irish and German Catholics, and that they somehow were less beholden to the whims of the Pope. So we can see that the Native American Party was full of contradictions. Some up north were anti-slavery, anti-immigration, and anti-Catholic, while the party down south was pro-slavery, anti-immigration, and nuanced on the Catholic question. The one thing that united them all was anti-immigration, which was a powerful sentiment in America at this time, especially in rapidly growing urban centers like New Orleans. However, the contradictions between branches and members within the party would ultimately lead to its undoing, but that is a story for another time. For now, to summarize this section, the party allegiances of New Orleans seemed to flip-flop during this period because there were issues that faced the city that did not necessarily affect the rest of the state, making multiple parties electorally viable. With all that being said, as we move on from the 1830s, we see a big shift in the politics of New Orleans and Louisiana. Economics often drives politics, and so it is only natural that when there is a shift in the economic fortunes of a population, there will be a corresponding shift in the political attitudes. The first mention of the cyclical nature of economics was in 1819, but the theory wouldn't evolve into the commonly understood periodic cycle of boom and bust until the 1860s. However, people living through the 19th century didn't need economic theories to understand that the capitalist system at this time was exceptionally fickle. In places like New Orleans, where growth in trade and population helped to blunt the blows of recession and depression, there was still widespread understanding that today's economic miracle could easily turn into tomorrow's economic disaster. The psychological weight of economic anxiety weighed heavier and heavier on the general population as the 1800s progressed. Leading up to the year of 1842, Louisiana politicians, both mayors and governors, as well as Whigs and Democrats, had tried to steady the ship of capitalism through the implementation of public works, government investment, and centralized financial institutions. Their efforts had proved futile against the monumental task of wrestling the economic current. So when people went to the voting booth in 1842, at least those few rich enough and white enough to vote, they went with change on their minds. In April, they elected the unremarkable Denis Perieux as mayor, but he was soon replaced by William Ferré, a mixed Anglo and Creole man, whose politics leaned towards his Anglo side, as he was a previous member of the Native American Party. Mayor Ferré pursued policies of anti-Creole and anti-immigration, while also deviating from his predecessors by trying to balance the state budget by reducing the amount of government projects in the city, although ironically, he is most famous for establishing free public education in the city, which was certainly a big expense. Ferré was aided on the state level by the winner of the 1842 gubernatorial race, Alexandre Mouton. Governor Mouton was a huge indicator of the changes that were sweeping Louisiana politics, as he was the first Democrat to win governorship, and ushered in the first age of Democratic dominance of that office that would last up until the Civil War. Mouton took office after the economic contraction of 1841-1842, which had discredited the Whig opposition's methods of dealing with economic problems. He was elected with a mandate of radical change, and he certainly did not fail on this account. Mouton was one of those men who obsessed with running government like a business, and one thing that businesses cannot accept is an unbalanced budget. The massive expenditures of the state mainly came down to the Whigs' pet projects of internal improvement, so Mouton got rid of those. Any equipment or manpower already purchased for such projects were promptly liquidated and sold off to private interests. Mouton was also a pioneer in the practice of using incarcerated citizens as cheap manual labor, which he doled out at a bargain price to even more private interests. This practice would eventually be expanded in Louisiana after the 13th Amendment to an industrial scale that rivaled slavery in its subjugation of human souls. All these policies were par for the course for Democratic politicians, so this was all expected from the political elite, of whom less than 10,000 voted for Mouton, which still gave him 54% of the vote. To put into perspective how exclusive politics had become at this point, the population of New Orleans was 102,000, which was a little less than a third of the total population of Louisiana at around 350,000. This meant that less than 3% of the population of the state was deciding who was governor, and by the way, the mayoral election of 1840 was won with 1,051 votes, constituting less than 1% of New Orleans' population. Governor Mouton decided it was time to change this. The Democratic Party was at least nominally a populist party that favored the rural yeoman and worker over the urbanite wealthy industrialist and financier, so an expansion of the franchise would invariably benefit them greatly. To this end, in July 1844, Mouton called for a constitutional convention to revise the state government, the first convention called since before statehood in 1812. At first, the convention gathered in Jackson, a small town north of Baton Rouge, but after a few months of debate, there had been almost no movement on the issues, so the gathering was adjourned to be picked back up in January, this time in New Orleans. The exact place of the Constitutional Convention was the newly constructed St. Louis Hotel, which sat at the corner of St. Louis and Royal Street, next to Jackson Square. Although the St. Louis Hotel was demolished in 1914, the spot it sat on is still occupied by a hotel, now known as the Omni Royal Orleans. Back in 1844, the St. Louis was one of the most popular slave auction sites in the city and had rooms large enough to accommodate the Constitutional Convention that now convened there. This time, while there was still fierce debate over the contents of the new state constitution, they were finally able to hash out a document that could be approved by the majority of the legislature. This new constitution was radically different from the first. Its obvious goal was to limit the power of the state government over private businesses and to expand education and voting rights to all white men. It severely limited the amount of investment the state could conduct in corporations, and it removed the property qualifications for voting, while also guaranteeing free public education for white people. Hoping to make these changes permanent, the Constitution also stipulated a much more rigorous process for amending the document to prevent the Whigs from meddling with it should they return to power. The popular vote to approve the Constitution goes to show just how ubiquitous the desire for change was when it was approved by a vote of 12,227 to 1,385. You might be wondering how such a radical shift was approved by such a large margin of the voting population. After all, just 6 years earlier, the state of Louisiana was electing its 7th straight Whiggish governor. Well, the fact of the matter was that the voters, i.e. the wealthy elite of white Creoles and Anglo-Americans, weren't really ideologically committed to the Whigs. They simply believed that government control and internal improvements were the most beneficial policies towards their material interests. The crisis of 1841-1842 had shaken this belief. They were more than willing to switch sides if it meant that their profits would go up. It isn't like the new Constitution was anti-business. In fact, it cut the reins the government had been using to curb the most aggressive of private corporations, and allowed for even more unrestrained capital accumulation to occur. It did undermine the political power of the rich by expanding the franchise to poor white male farmers and workers, but since the government had less power to control the rich, they were willing to make this concession as the masses would not be able to fight the moneyed interests using their newly gained political voice. Underneath all of this was, of course, the black population of New Orleans and Louisiana. The wealthier middle-class Creoles of color were partially tied to the political fortunes of the white Creoles, who who represented their class interests but not their racial interests in the political arena. Now that the political power was being dispersed more evenly among the white population, the Creoles of color were losing class power without being compensated with more political power. The less wealthy of the free people of color were even worse off because they could no longer have the benefits of government public works projects and had to rely on the goodwill of the wealthy to improve their conditions, goodwill that was rare if not completely absent. The enslaved black people were getting the short end of the stick either way. Their lot would not be improved, short of an apocalyptic restructuring of the so-called natural order. With the ratification of the new state constitution, Mouton's job was done. The constitution reformatted the gubernatorial elections, which cut his term by 1 year and called for new elections under a different format to occur in 1846. This new format took power out of the hands of the legislature and made the election contingent on only the popular vote. Coincidentally, this is when we start getting real electoral data that shows what had already been understood about the politics of Louisiana around that time. The results by county for the 1846 gubernatorial election shows us that there was a pretty clear party geographical divide in Louisiana. The south of the state, mainly New Orleans and the surrounding counties, were predominantly Creole and bastions of the Whig Party. The north and west of the state voted mostly Democratic. Under the new suffrage laws, the total voting population rose from 17,773 in 1842 to 22,767 in 1846. This was a modest increase and still constituted a small minority of the overall population, but each subsequent election would see a gradual rise in the franchise as more and more white men exercised their right to vote. More important was the removal of the General Assembly's choosing between the two highest vote-getters, making the election truly democratic. It seems almost fitting that this new era of democracy in New Orleans and Louisiana should coincide with the beginning of a new set of dramatic events that would disturb the placid waters of the Crescent City. The 3 decades after the Battle of New Orleans that we have covered in the last episode and a half can be generally characterized as a period of relatively peaceful growth and development for New Orleans. While political storms whirled in the city, the state, and the country, New Orleans remained prosperous through all of it. Although they could not possibly have foreseen it, the long line of events that fell like dominoes upon the city were first pushed in 1846. To set the political stage for this watershed year, we have to go back to the presidential election of 1844. In this election, the Democratic nominee, James K. Polk, narrowly edged out the Whig candidate, Henry Clay, in the popular vote, but won with a comfortable margin in the Electoral College. Looming over the election was a sectional crisis within both the Democratic and Whig parties. Slavery and Western expansion were the prominent issues of the day, and each party had factions within that had differing views on each issue. The question that remained was which party would crack first, and how would its destruction affect the political scene. Apparently God himself wanted to know the answer to this question, so he sent a little divine intervention to the presidential office to hasten a resolution. In 1841, a cold rainstorm on Inauguration Day weakened the health of newly elected Whig President William Henry Harrison. When this was not enough, a month later, President Harrison was caught in another rainstorm. This one would prove fatal. Into the office stepped Vice President John Tyler. Now President Tyler was never supposed to have become president. He was a compromise candidate to appease some of the more radical pro-slavery parts of the Whig coalition and did not represent the wider base of the admittedly patchwork political alliance. This meant going into the 1844 election, the Whigs were in complete disarray on the presidential ticket. Tyler was the incumbent Whig president, but his actions in office had further alienated the rest of the party, so they looked to nominate Henry Clay to lead the party. The breakdown of party discipline allowed the Democrats to sneak their way back into the presidency, and Tyler made the controversial decision to offer annexation to Texas as a kind of symbolic flipping of the table as he was pushed out the door. The annexation of Texas was the umbrella that covered both the slavery and westward expansion issues. At this time, there were 26 states in the Union, and there just so happened to be an equal number of slave states and free states. This meant that the sectional issue of slavery was precariously balanced within the federal government, and any disturbance caused by, say, the admission of another state would tip the scales toward one side or the other and force a potentially violent reaction. And this was only the problem the addition of Texas posed on the domestic front. On the international stage, Mexico was contesting the claim the US had over Texas and was threatening war if the annexation went through. The risk of war with Mexico was of particular worry to New Orleans. Before Texas, Louisiana was the furthest southwestern state in the country, and should the Mexicans overcome the US Army, they would certainly invade New Orleans first. It was an obvious target as the capital of and the largest city in Louisiana, as well as the gateway to the Mississippi. However, the pro-slavery and pro-expansionist political elite in New Orleans did support the annexation of Texas in principle. If it was done and war with Mexico was avoided, then Texas would become a buffer between Louisiana and Mexico, as well as boosting the political power of the slave states. While the people and politicians in New Orleans were debating the pros and cons of the situation, the Texans approved annexation, and President Polk admitted them into the Union on December of 1845 as the 28th state. Wait, did I get that right? 28th? Didn't I just say there were 26 states before Texas's annexation? Yes, that was right. But 4 months before Texas was annexed, Florida entered the Union as the 27th state. Now, as Texas entered, a two-state majority was created on the slavery side, and things were about to get heated. If the folks down in New Orleans were worried about the international backlash to the grabbing of Texas, their fears were not assuaged by President Polk, who controversially set the Texas border at the Rio Grande, instead what Mexico recognized as the border at the Nueces River. He further ensured that there would be conflict when he sent a written declaration to the government in Texas that America would defend them no matter what. So here we are at the precipice of the Mexican-American War, and let's check in with New Orleans. As I previously mentioned, the 1846 gubernatorial election was the first conducted under the new state constitution that widened the franchise among white men and did away with the General Assembly's role of choosing the winner. Democratic candidate Isaac Johnson won the popular vote, and thus the election by a comfortable margin. Governor Johnson was a huge supporter of the war with Mexico, and he rallied the men and resources of Louisiana for the cause. But Johnson didn't think that the war should just be fought to protect the newly acquired state of Texas. No, he was a radical expansionist and a huge proponent of slavery, so he believed that the Mexican-American War should be fought with the goal of not just securing Texas, not just acquiring new territory in New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, and California, but that all of Mexico should be annexed and turned into slave territory. Needless to say, Johnson was a representative of the absolute most radical wing of the pro-slavery expansionist sentiment in America. There were certainly some within New Orleans that shared this sentiment, but self-made man and newly elected mayor Abdiel Crossman was not one of them. He, unlike many of his predecessors, was not a plantation owner, and while he wasn't anti-slavery, its continuation and expansion was not a primary concern to him. His primary concern was the well-being of New Orleans, which was directly threatened by the war. Much to his dislike, New Orleans soon became the launching ground for the planned invasion of Mexico. The introduction of a large number of rowdy and unsavory military men to the population of the city proved to be the first of many challenges of Crossman's career. Disease and disorderly conduct were just some of the things that these men brought to New Orleans, and it fell to the locals to deal with these problems as best they could. As the war dragged on, these problems became more and more pronounced. Rampant disease in military camps and poor living conditions caused American morale to plummet even as they steadily progressed further and further towards victory. Funnily enough, all these men were volunteers. They had been suckered into signing up for the war by American propaganda, but as soon as they reached the front, the horrors of the reality of war set in, and many regretted their decision to join up. Over the course of the war, more than 9,000 soldiers would desert, and many of these men made their way back north along the Gulf Coast to New Orleans. They arrived as criminals and in poor temperament, which added to the overall disgust towards the army in the city. Crossman did his best to alleviate the worst of these problems. He organized charitable projects to help wounded, sick, and angry soldiers, while providing security to the local residents from the influx of criminality. So while Governor Johnson was banging the drum of nationalistic manifest destiny and driving the men of Louisiana into volunteering for the army, Mayor Crossman was dealing with the reality of what war really meant for the state and its capital. The situation would drag on from 1846 until the war's end in 1848, where America was overwhelmingly victorious, but settled on not annexing all of Mexico like Johnson and others wanted. Instead, they took most of what today is recognizable as the southwest of the USA in California. New Orleans had weathered the storm of the war, and its importance as a port of departure for the military further established the city as one of the most important in the country. Furthermore, the problem of admitting 2 new slave states to the Union was resolved during the war, as Polk's administration also saw the addition of Iowa and Wisconsin in 1846 and 1848 respectively, bringing the total up to 30 and re-establishing the even split, now at 15 apiece. The annexation of Texas and the Mexican-American War could have quickly led to a total collapse of the American system, but the addition of Iowa and Wisconsin, as well as complete victory in the war, saved the Union, at least for the time being. Observers in 1848 could look back at 1846 and wipe their brows, having seemingly just dodged a bullet. But as I said before, 1846 was just the first domino to fall, leading to a complete remaking of the country, and perhaps causing the biggest change in New Orleans in its history. But now was a time of celebration, because the war was over and things could surely only get better from here. The optimism at this time could best be shown by the mayoral election of April of 1848, which saw Crossman rewarded for his kind-hearted and practical approach to governing by winning his re-election with 2,000 more votes than his first. Governor Johnson, on the other hand, was ousted in his 1848 election, as his capitulations to Whig demands had lost him support within his own party. The Whigs were also bolstered in the statewide elections by the participation of Louisiana resident, hero of the Mexican-American War, and Whig presidential candidate Zachary Taylor. The 1848 presidential election would see Louisiana flip from Democrat to Whig, and continued their perfect record of siding with the eventual winner, if you count the special election of John Quincy Adams. Yes, things were looking to be on the up and up for New Orleans in 1848, but unfortunately this year would prove to only be a brief intermission in the troubles hitting the city from all sides. A levee, if you will, holding back the waters of turmoil. The levee broke, metaphorically and literally, in May of 1849, about 17 miles upriver of New Orleans' second municipality, also known as Uptown. There was a plantation known as Sauve Plantation. It butted up against the Mississippi River and was protected from floodwaters by a levee, as much of the land in the Mississippi River Delta was. However, the spring rains of 1849 had swelled the Mississippi more than it had been in the last 20 years or so. Then, on May 3rd, the levee broke and the river began flowing onto the plantation with a force that was impossible to contain. Sauve Plantation was immediately destroyed by the flooding, but as the water spread, the citizens of New Orleans hoped that it could be diverted away from the city and into Bayou St. John. Their hopes and prayers were fruitless, as 12 days after the levee first broke, the water had reached the far border of Uptown, where it became the French Quarter at Rampart Street. Luckily, the flood had been slow enough for the first municipality to build enough of an impromptu levee to keep the French Quarter safe. From here, the water was diverted into Carondelet Canal, and from there out to Lake Pontchartrain. The efforts of the people of the city saved the French Quarter in downtown, but Uptown was devastated by the water. It continued to pour in from the broken levee until it reached its deepest almost a month after the initial breakage. Over 200 city blocks were underwater, and over 12,000 citizens of the second municipality were driven from their homes. The number of people displaced was likely larger than this, since there was also a lot of flooding in the peripheral towns of New Orleans, which were not included in the official record. It is hard to calculate the financial impact of the flooding, but we do know that in 1850, the taxes in the second municipality were raised to the tune of an extra $400,000 for repair to damage done by the flooding. That is over $16 million in today's money. New Orleans has borne the brunt of many natural disasters, but this flood is only rivaled by one, that of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. A comparison of these two events to understand just how devastating the flood of 1849 was is that the water level in 1849 was actually higher than after Katrina. And while Katrina flooded a larger urban area, most of the land covered by the water in 1849 was still unincorporated swampland. Luckily, This would be the last time in New Orleans' history that the Mississippi broke its levees and directly flooded the city. In the midst of this travesty, New Orleans was hit by another insult from the state government. 1849 was the year the Anglo-Americans finally got their wish, and the capital of Louisiana was permanently relocated to Baton Rouge. At this point in time, Baton Rouge had less than 2% of the population of New Orleans, but most important to the people in charge, these 2% were not Creoles. Leading into the second half of the 19th century, the movement of the capital reflected Louisiana's further movement away from its Creole roots to a character more in line with the rest of the American South. 1850 proved to be another small intermission in the sequence of major events in New Orleans as the city recovered from the floods and continued to grow. Immigration from Europe was peaking during the decade of 1840 to 1850. Famines and political revolutions were pushing people out of the Old World, and a gold rush in the American West was bringing them to the United States. Many landed in New York and the famous Ellis Island, but others came to New Orleans, where they then spread across the American West. But some stayed, especially Irish laborers who began to become a truly significant demographic in the city at this time. The great movement of people in the mid-19th century needed to be facilitated by a great revolution in transportation. The steamship made travel over the world's oceans and rivers faster, and the railroad made travel over land even more speedy. Mayor Crossman knew that if New Orleans did not get on board with the transportation revolution, then it would be left behind, so he made a concerted effort to obtain charters from private companies to build railroad connections between New Orleans and other rapidly expanding Midwest, West, and Southern cities. He also petitioned the federal government to open a naval depot in the Crescent City to accommodate the increase in shipping traffic. While the 1840 to 1850 period did not see the ludicrous growth that the last decade had, New Orleans' population did experience a respectable growth of nearly 14%. Of all the new arrivals in New Orleans, there was one man in particular that would cause quite a bit of trouble for Crossman and the Spanish citizens of the city. This man was Narciso Lopez, a former general in the Spanish army. Lopez had a harebrained idea to lead an army of Cuban exiles to take the island from the Spanish and give it to the United States. His plan found many supporters in the South who hoped that Cuba could become the next Texas, vis-a-vis a new slave state to once again tip the balance between free and slave states. His base of operations was in New Orleans, and many prominent citizens of the city personally funded his endeavor. In 1851, Lopez finally launched his expedition to take Cuba with only a few hundred men. Most of these men were not Cuban, but rather imperialist adventurers, completely seduced by the idea of spreading American sovereignty across the Caribbean. In a scene that foreshadowed the failed U.S. invasion at the Bay of Pigs over 100 years later, Lopez's expedition did not receive the popular support he expected from the Cuban population, and he was subsequently captured and executed. The brutality of his execution sparked outrage throughout the American South, most acutely in New Orleans, where a mob attacked the Spanish consulate and many Spanish-owned businesses. This was the big dramatic set piece of 1851, which broke the tentative tranquility of 1850. But this wasn't just an important event in New Orleans history. It was also an important event in the history of international relations, as Mayor Crossman had made no concerted effort to stop the mob. The Spanish government took this as tacit governmental approval of their actions and demanded the U.S. pay reparations for the damaged property. The U.S. Secretary of State managed to plead America's case and established the precedent that countries are not responsible for what unruly mobs of their citizens do. The U.S. did end up paying a sum of money to the Spanish government as an apology for the trouble, but they made it clear that this was just out of courtesy and not obligation. All of these troubles, the Mexican-American War, the Suave Plantation Flood, the uncontrollable mob in 1851, highlighted the feebleness of New Orleans' city government. All of these problems could have been less major if they were responded to more efficiently and with more resources. So it became clear to everyone that the status quo of the three municipalities had to change. This was the crowning achievement for Mayor Crossman. The dissolution of the three-way split system was the thing he is most remembered for and celebrated for. The system was based on the unique political nature of New Orleans and how the different ethnicities of the city coexisted. It was created because the Creoles did not necessarily want to live under the rule of Anglos, and vice versa, but they were forced to because of the centralization of the city government. The splitting of the municipalities created self-governing, semi-autonomous districts based roughly around the different living spaces of the ethnicities. The Creoles primarily resided in the French Quarter and Tremé, so this became the first municipality. The Anglo businessmen primarily resided in the Central Business District or Uptown, so this became the second municipality. The third municipality, or Downtown, was also predominantly Anglo and non-French speaking immigrants, but since it was cut off from the second district geographically by the French Quarter, it had to be its own entity. This system satisfied the ethnic tensions somewhat in the city, but it was a horribly inefficient way of administering to the needs of its citizens. Policing, building, repairing, even commerce became a bureaucratic nightmare when 3 separate city councils began bickering over the resources of the city. Mayors who operated under this system found their hands tied tightly with red tape, and in crisis scenarios like the ones Crossman endured, this was unacceptable. Finally, in 1852, the state legislature passed a bill and it was signed by the governor, officially marking the end of the 3 municipalities. As a consequence of the new system, which established a single municipality consisting of 9 wards which would elect aldermen to serve as the legislative branch and a mayor to serve as the executive branch, the government of the city became much more centralized and much more Americanized. The 4th, 5th, and 6th wards consisted of the area that had previously been the second municipality, the American District, and it was in these wards that the heart of the power of the city would begin to move. The newly constructed City Hall on Lafayette Street became the headquarters for the new government. Businesses, wanting to be close to the halls of power, moved their locations to Camp and Carondelet streets. The banks could not follow the businesses out of the French Quarter, because the Creoles who had chartered them made certain to specify in their contracts that the financial institutions could not be located north of Canal Street. The old heart of the city, the French Quarter, remained an important cultural center, but its dominance over politics and commerce that had lasted over 200 years had come to an end. Much like the relocation of the state capital to Baton Rouge, the redistricting of New Orleans made it more American and less Creole. 1852 was undoubtedly the pinnacle of Crossman's tenure as mayor. He had led the city faithfully through the troubles and done away with the hated 3-municipality system. To top it all off, the persistent plagues of yellow fever that had killed up to 3,000 people a year between 1822 and 1847 had been absent from the city for the last 5 years. At least that is what the pro-Crossman press alleged. In reality, yellow fever had stopped being a major killer of the native New Orleans residents who had survived since 1822. It was still the leading cause of death among the large portion of the population who had moved to the city within the last 30 years, namely immigrants and Northern Americans. To Crossman's credit, he had done an admirable job instituting policies that helped decrease the severity of the plagues. He had drained a major swamp outside the city limits, passed public health ordinances, and patronized the charity hospital that cared for the sick. All of his efforts, however, were in vain, because in 1853, the city was once again rapidly expanding, and this meant lots of construction and digging, which, when it rained, created stagnant water pools throughout the city, the ideal conditions for the breeding of yellow fever-carrying mosquitoes. The deaths began trickling in, one at a time, starting at the end of May. In June, the recorded deaths were 625, but this included other non-yellow fever-related diseases, so the alarm was not raised. By mid-July, however, the numbers jumped dramatically, and talk began circulating about what the precautions should be taken to avoid an epidemic. The citizens of New Orleans were not aware that the epidemic had already started. While public health officials and doctors tried to assuage the public's fears, there were 100 people dying every day by the end of July. Finally, in August, the city council took action to treat the disease, but preventative measures were implemented far too late. At this time, many private citizens lended aid to the city, the most famous of which was the voodoo queen Marie Laveau, who had been operating an unofficial medical practice out of her beauty salon for some years now. Her fame as a healer and the supernatural properties of her voodoo potions spread just as fast as the yellow fever. Unfortunately, she was just one woman, and she could not save everyone. The epidemic would reach its deadly peak by August 22nd, when 239 people died within the course of 24 hours. The deaths would slowly taper off as the weather turned colder and the mosquitoes died, but up until December there were still people dying of the fever. In the end, we will never truly know the exact number of people in New Orleans who died as a consequence of yellow fever, but most estimates put it around 7,000 to 10,000, or 8 to 10% of the total population, making the 1853 epidemic one of the deadliest per capita health disasters in history. As I already mentioned, death was not equally distributed among the population. Of the thousands who died, only 87 of them were native-born New Orleanians. This can be attributed to two factors. One was natural immunity acquired through inoculation by those who had survived previous epidemics, and another was socioeconomic conditions. It is no wonder that the disease spread most rapidly through the immigrant communities who lived in slums and did not have as easy access to city health services. There was also a divide in the number of deaths between black and white residents. The mortality rate among white residents, again mainly Irish and German immigrants, was around 7.4% of those infected, while for the black population it was 0.2%. Again, this comes down to natural immunity, and perhaps that not all deaths of black patients were reported by doctors who did not see their lives as worthwhile as white people. Additionally, the reward for the black population for surviving such a disaster was that they had the unenviable task of disposing of the bodies of the killed and cleaning the city in hopes of mitigating the spread. It was a sour note to end the tenure of Mayor Crossman, who had, during his 8 years in office, done perhaps more than any other mayor for the city. In particular, his support for public works projects that would benefit all residents of the city, such as public schools, hospitals, and railroads, increased the standard of living for the entire city. These efforts did not go unnoticed by the people, as evidenced by Crossman winning his re-election in 1852, despite a very energetic opposition. Had the election taken place after the disaster of the 1853 epidemic, he likely would have still won the race, since the immigrants killed by yellow fever were a dependable voting bloc against him. Whatever the case, his term ended in 1854, and by the terms of the new charter that he had championed, he was forbidden from running for immediate re-election. Crossman decided to move on to less public-facing roles as a civil servant. As the elections of 1854 came nearer, there was a definite air of discontent in New Orleans. The papers that had called for the rechartering of the city in 1852 and cheered its success now complained that Crossman's final term had been marked by a flaccid administration that was bogged down by partisan politics and bureaucracy to the point where it was no longer effective at attending to the needs of the city. In contrast, these same papers printed numerous columns lauding the departing mayor for his personal character and his commitment to progress. Outside of Crossman's personal popularity, however, there was a rising sentiment that the career politicians were not serving the city of New Orleans, and a reform movement formed for really the first time in the city's history. The spirit of the reform movement was to cut through party lines to nominate people based not on who they were affiliated with, but how much they wanted to change the city. As a result, the reform slate that was eventually presented to the public included prominent members of both the Whig and Democratic Party. But as the press made sure everyone took notice, it did not include a single person who was not born in America. This sparked rumors that the reform movement was really just a guise to recreate the Native American Party, who persecuted immigrants and Catholics. But this conflicted with another rumor, that the Reform Party was just the Whig Party under another name, meant to trick Democratic voters into throwing their votes into the opposition. All the claims that the press made were unsubstantiated as of the election, but they did ensure that the election day would be incredibly emotionally charged. The tense attitude hanging over the city is evident by the unusual number of incidents of election interference. The French Quarter was an oasis among the chaos, as its 3 districts submitted their votes without incident, but elsewhere in the city, drama was ensuing. In the 1st District of Uptown, there was a violent fight that led to 2 deaths, one a citizen and the other a policeman. There were fights at the other precincts, and some polls were taken over by gangs who turned away any voter not committed to their desired candidates. The violence did not end when the voting stopped, as several counting locations saw conflict between reform supporters who wanted to certify that the votes were being counted correctly and the police, who barred them entry due to them not being polling officials. In the end, thousands of votes were cast and counted, and plenty of blood had been shed. The Reform Party lost the crucial mayoral race to Democrat John Lewis in the elections of 3 members of the all-important police board, ensuring that the police force would remain under the thumb of machine politics. Yet Reform triumphed elsewhere on the ballot, winning the rest of the positions in the municipal government. The Reformers entered office with the mandate to fix the finances of New Orleans, trim the fat off the city government, and most importantly, reform the police force. Mayor Lewis was not a reformer, and his goals in office were to continue the investment into railroads that Crossman had begun, and to conduct public beautification and improvement projects in order to woo the voters for his future re-election. The goals of the mayor and the reformers were not always in contradiction. While the reformers generally sought to cut down on government expenditure and overreach, they made exceptions for the massive commitment of funds to the railroad companies on account of their vital importance to the commerce of the city. Likewise, they did not interfere with some of the more sensational improvements Lewis suggested, because it would have been political suicide to stand against public opinion on that matter. Thus, the mayor was able to commit the exorbitant sum of $3 million toward the creation of the New Orleans, Jackson, and Great Northern Railroad Company, and he was able to construct one of, if not the most recognizable symbols of New Orleans, the statue of Andrew Jackson on horseback that sits in Jackson Square. What the reformers managed to do was raise taxes to pay off city debts that had been accrued by the government overreach into public works, specifically improvements to the wharf, which were left unfinished after the fund dried up. Once the city debt was cleared, the reformers went about doing as their name suggests, reforming the government, especially the fire department and the land assessment department. All in all, the taxes and reduction in spending managed to place New Orleans' budget back in the black, which subsequently gave the reformers enough political capital to push for a new city charter. The charter of 1852 was less than 4 years old at this point, but the reformers argued that while it had done much to improve the efficiency of New Orleans' government, it had not gone far enough. This new charter ensured that the next man to become mayor would be much more powerful than the office had previously been. Not only would he have full control over the all-important police force, but his grip over the rest of the municipal government would be impossibly tight. There was a sense that the mayoral race of 1856 would be the most consequential election in the city's history, and each party gathered in the spring of that year to put their best foot forward. The Democrats met on May 10th for their nomination convention. Their hands were tied by the city charter, in the sense that they could not renominate the incumbent Lewis, as mayors were forbidden from serving consecutive terms. Instead, they chose prominent local lawyer William Elmore to represent the party at the top of the ticket. The Whigs had been decimated by defections to the Reform ticket and the collapse of the National Party. They were such a non-entity at this point that they neglected to nominate anyone for the mayorship. It is possible that if he desired, ex-Mayor Crossman could have run again, as his terms would not be consecutive, but he was satisfied to continue serving from the sidelines and did not seek the Whig nomination. A week after the Democrats met, there was a meeting that called for the establishment of a non-partisan citizens' ticket, which everyone knew was just another name for the Reform ticket. The spirit of the meeting was an open forum, where anyone, regardless of a party affiliation, could be nominated with the expectation that they would support the cause of cleaning up the government. However, there was a group that attended the meeting with a more partisan goal in mind, and they quickly took control of the proceedings. This group was one that had long been rumored to be the shadowy puppet masters of the reform movement, and by hijacking the nomination meeting, they confirmed the rumors, which had to this point been unsubstantiated. This was the American Party, or as they were known colloquially, the Know-Nothings. It just so happens that 1854 to 1856 was the absolute peak of Know-Nothing popularity throughout the United States. To add context to the rise of the Know-Nothings, by 1854 the Whig Party had collapsed under its own internal contradictions, but there was still a desire for the opposition party that would stand against the Democrats. The two major contestants on who this opposition would solidify under were the Republican Party and the Know-Nothings. The Republicans represented the radical anti-slavery attitude that was gaining momentum in America, while the Know-Nothings rallied behind the banner of pro-nativist anti-immigration sentiment. The Know-Nothings were ambivalent towards the issue of slavery, so they were able to make inroads as the opposition in the southern states, such as Louisiana, while the Republican base remained mostly in the north. Perhaps in no other state in the South was the Know-Nothing platform more enticing than Louisiana. Louisiana, specifically New Orleans, had more immigrants than anyone else, and a more entrenched Catholic population, which had built up resentment from Protestant Anglo-Americans. In the gubernatorial election of 1855, Charles D'Aubigny, son of the former governor, ran under the Know-Nothing ticket and managed to get 4,000 more votes than the last opposition candidate had gotten, though he was ultimately defeated by the Democratic nominee. Elsewhere, though, the Know-Nothings were proving to be a force to reckon with, as they won numerous contested elections in the state. In 1856, the Know-Nothings knew that they needed to follow through on this momentum by winning important races to prove that they weren't just opposition to the Democrats, but the more popular party. With the stakes being so high, it should be no surprise that the intimidation tactics and violence that occurred in the 1854 election came back into play. Again, 2 people were killed as a result of the fighting at the polls, and dozens more were wounded. The intimidation worked, as many immigrants chose to stay home rather than risk being beaten or killed just for exercising their right to vote. The Know-Nothing mayoral candidate, Waterman, won the election by a margin of less than 2,000 votes. There were 4,000 less total votes than the last election. That is where we will end today's episode. Those listeners who are good at remembering important dates will notice that we are leaving off just 5 years before the start of the American Civil War, an event that obviously affected New Orleans a lot. Therefore, you might assume that the start of the Civil War would be the more logical conclusion to our episode and a good spot to pick up on next time. I would argue that the election of Waterman was the final domino to fall in the long chain that went back to 1846, especially when considering New Orleans in particular, because it was the breakdown of the Democratic Whig party system that is inexorably tied to the cause of the Civil War. The issue of slavery had bubbled under the surface of American politics since the beginning, but by 1856 it had become so volatile that it destroyed the Whigs, and its trajectory pointed towards the sundering of the entire nation. So next episode, we will pick up where the Whigs died, and even though New Orleanians in 1856 didn't know that the Civil War was coming, they certainly felt in the air that their golden age had ended, and an era of violence was at hand. Please join me for that exciting story next time in the history of New Orleans.